Welcome back to Beautiful Work, Beautiful Life. We are here talking all things inner life. And today we're focusing on the upper part of our body, which we don't always do we, Laurel?
We do not.
We don't. And yet, I think this is going to be a really powerful show because if we allow ourselves, right, to get a little educated in what we're going to talk about today, it can make a world of difference in terms of how we navigate life and how we can really understand ourselves and how we operate in the world a lot better. So
I
let me.
can't wait to hear more.
I know. Let's introduce our topic. So, our question to our listeners today is, what can you learn from your shadow? That's the title of our show. And we can learn so very much that can be so helpful to us, especially in times of trouble.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And it's so interesting because I do think now we've talked about
Mhm.
shadow before
We have.
and shadow work. And it is one of those things I always think that once that you learn what your shadow is or who your shadow is and how your shadow shows up,
Yeah.
I really think that's where you begin to learn from your shadow. When you're first getting to know your shadow, or you're not accustomed to letting your shadow out,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
it's, you can't learn from that which you hide, right?
Yes. Yes. It's hard. And it's not always easy to get immediately and quickly connected with our shadow. So it takes a little bit of effort. And also, it takes a lot of humility. That's
Oh,
what I think.
yes.
So let's
Oh,
start there. Okay.
yes.
So the
Okay.
first thing that you can learn from being willing to do your shadow work and to get connected with your shadow is you can grow your humility.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. And so can you think of an example of when you were learning
Oh
your
gosh.
humility?
I sure can. I sure can. I was really struggling with family stuff. And one of the things that was really disturbing to me was family members that would just talk about themselves and they had no apparent interest in other people. And they would talk over other people and they would just be very, what to me looked like very self absorbed. And I felt like I had to be really careful in this particular situation because I couldn't exactly call them out because I was trying to build relationships with these people. So it was a tricky situation, you know. And I think that the way I handled it first and foremost was I recognized that it was there. I recognized that I had really, really strong feelings about it that weren't very kind. Okay. And so realizing that, I realized I had to, I didn't have to. I wanted to wrestle with this internally and come to a place where I could show up as my best self. And it was a long journey to get there. And what I realized was, in sitting in my meditation chair and what I call looking in my reflecting pool at myself and wondering, like, why is this so upsetting to me? Right. And for me, it was like a long standing going back to wanting to be seen, wanting to be heard, but being afraid of it and not knowing how to navigate that territory really well. Okay. So somebody who can easily talk about themselves and not care a bit about somebody else, right, is just able to show a part of me that I can't get in touch with, couldn't get in touch with.
Yeah, such a
Right.
good example.
And it was very humbling to realize, like I do have that part of me, right? There are moments when I'm upset and I just want to be heard and I don't care what the other person thinks. Okay. When I'm upset, I'm in that space. So it's not like I don't have that part of me. I
Yeah.
had to humbly look at where is that part of me and how does it show up?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's so good. And I do think, we're talking about what you can learn from your shadow, but oftentimes it's other people who bring the situation forward for us, right?
Yes. Yes.
So that we can begin to self-reflect. And it is a shadow when, I know this to be true about myself. And it was, most apparent through an exercise that I in a workshop that I went to with my energy provider. And um, it was an exercise, like a journaling exercise to think of someone who you have a little bit of what I could now call resistance, but it was conflict, right?
Yep.
Where, and you might call it a trigger, right? Someone
Yeah.
that triggers you or you have some conflict with, and writing about the situation and what that person did that caused you to feel this conflict, and then write about a time when you did the same thing.
Yeah.
And so it's like not just the actions that they did, but how it made you feel, and then bringing it home
Mm-hmm.
to, like you said, the humility to know, oh, I have that ability also. And I've made another person feel that way before.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it really is an interesting self reflection. And all of a sudden, it's apparent why you might not want to be in that situation or be with that other person, because you're actually with a side of yourself that you're trying to
Yeah.
contain,
Yeah. Yeah.
or
This
that you
is,
don't admire.
yeah, that you don't admire or that you really struggle with. So the context that we want to put this in as we begin to, look at the examples that we give here today is, what can you learn from your shadow, right? So as I progressed in that journey, right, is recognizing particularly like now, right? We're in a space where we're on a podcast. We are speaking what we think out into the world. And it's not that we don't care about what other people think, but there's nobody on the other side of this talking back with us, having a conversation. And so in order to be able to do this, right, I have to be okay with the part of me, right? That is, I'm not listening to anybody else right now. I'm just speaking what I think, right? And I have to get okay with that. And for me, that was a struggle because that's not how I tend to be wired. You know what I mean? Like, and in order to like progress in my profession and in my work world and in feeling like my own confidence, right? If I want to get up and speak in groups, which I've done, like I have to be okay with being the speaker, not being the listener.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that too is such a great example of really, bringing it to, what is it, what trait is it, what ability is it that doesn't come easy for you,
Yeah.
that you've, maybe put in the backseat, in the shadows, right? and
Right.
and I think some of it too is, the conditioning, right, of
Yeah.
who we are. Like, we are, you and I'm going to say, as coaches, we are deep listeners.
Hmm.
We do want to hold space for others, and we want to not just hold space for them, but give them the space. And
Yeah.
so when you do that your whole life, right, you want to be seen and heard, but your tendency, at least mine, is to give other people the opportunity to be seen and heard,
Yeah.
right? And so it's almost that it's that thing where you want to do it too, but you don't know how to bring that forward, even though, you know, sometimes, I mean, I've been there too, where I want to be seen and heard so very badly, it's not pretty.
Yeah. Right. Right.
I
Yeah.
need someone to hear what
Yeah.
is inside me coming out.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's not fit for a podcast, I assure you. and
Yeah.
and but being okay with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And also recognizing like if we can grow this part of ourself, right, and bring it into balance internally. So the goal of all of this, right, is to recognize we have all these qualities. We all have the qualities and they're somewhere within us. And the ones that we put in the shadow are the ones that for whatever reason, and there can be many reasons. And I'm going to give another example on the same one because I feel like it's a rich example too of how this can play out, right? Is when we put it in the shadow, right? Then it's not available to us to serve us and support us when we need it. And so, one of the other things that we can learn from shadow work is also some ego work, right? Is the ego needs to do the hard work of searching for that shadow part and learning how to bring it into balance in our lives. And so we can really, use our ego of like, okay, I have to grow myself to be humble enough, right? And then courageous enough to look at this part. And how do I bring it forth and groom it to serve me and to serve the world really well?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't wait to hear that example. And I think that's really important. What I'm hearing in your words are that often we judge our shadow side or some characteristic about ourselves, right? And we tuck it away. We put it in the shadow because we are judging it
Yeah.
rather than, as you say, grooming it, nurturing it,
Yeah.
bringing it out in a
Supporting
way
it.
that
Yeah.
serves us and the world,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting to think about. What is it that I'm going to say, Sean, what part of it, maybe the
Mhm.
question for our listeners, what part of yourself do you shun or judge to be negative?
Yes. Or here's another way that, we can do some shadow searching, shall we say, right?
Yeah.
Is thinking about what you're afraid of. Because oftentimes our shadow is connected to survival in a deep way in our psyche. And so, what we're afraid of, or what we want, but what we hold ourselves back from for some underlying fear, is the trailway to discover that, right? So,
Yeah.
here's my example that applies to that with the same thing we're talking about in my example today. So, because I've had a long standing, since I was very little, afraid to be in front of the class, at the front of the room, in front of people, getting very self conscious, embarrassed, really like in a way that was really distressful to me, right? Knowing that it's this deep seated thing, right? I've done a lot of work in my life as an adult to try to come to terms with that. And then also to try to flush it literally out of me, to understand why it's there, to flush it out. So I had a really wonderful hypnotherapy session. I had a couple sessions with a woman that was really great hypnotherapist. And I did a past life regression kind of work with her. And I had this really, really powerful visual and visceral experience of back sometime in my history. And some people believe this on it's kind of woo woo, but whatever works for you. Right. I was getting ready to get on a stage, and I got on the stage and I was being booed, and I was horribly, I was just horrified, like I was trembling, I was upset, and I knew I had to go back out and I didn't want to. Right. And so it's like, you call that whatever you want, whatever example you want, but it was that fear was so blatantly in me, and I could feel that fear in that session so clearly of, I don't want to be in front of people, right? Like this was a
Wow.
dreadful, awful thing, right? And so, for me, that helped to flush more out of me, right? Recognizing like, wow, that's in my energy somewhere. And how do I wrestle with that? And how do I not let that stop me from doing the things that I want to do in my life that require me to get up front,
Yes. And
Yeah.
it's so interesting, that example, because, whether you believe in past lives or not,
Mm.
in this lifetime,
Yeah.
all of our past experiences affect our current choices, right?
Yeah. Right.
And, tying it back to safety and survival, our body's goal between our
Yeah.
brain and our nervous system is to keep us safe. And so, whether we've experienced something in the past that has been, perceived as a threat, or we've witnessed someone else experience something, right? That does keep us, I guess, in this place of putting certain abilities, skills, experiences in the shadow, right? Not letting them come forward. And I do think that that's a really good lesson of, how do you know you're safe? How do you know that you will be safe, even if you're doing something that has been a risk before?
Absolutely. And we're actually going to do a whole show on that. coming up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll be diving into
Yes.
that topic because
Great.
that one's a big one, right? For so many of us. Yeah. The how do we handle the fear and the risk and where does safety really come from? So we're going to
Yeah.
speak into that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we can learn so much from our shadow, can't we, Laurel? I mean,
We
that's just
can.
one example in my life, one quality, one thing, but it was a big one, you know? So if you choose like a really big shadow thing for you, or you find one, you discover one, you're willing to like do that humbling work of looking at, like, what is it that really disturbs me in the world, and how do I, and if I get really inflamed about it, right? It's like, how can you take the time to reflect enough to find where and how it shows up in you, right?
Yes. And this practice, of learning from your shadow,
Mhm.
um, I think it is a gateway to learning um, self-compassion,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? You know, um, yeah, self-compassion. And as we become more self-compassionate and treat ourselves with love, loving
Yeah.
kindness, as I like to say,
Yeah.
we have the ability to treat more and more people that way because I do believe what side of us, whatever it is we're keeping in the shadow, that we let come forward and we hold it, in humility and
Mhm.
loving kindness. When we see that same thing in other people, it allows us to hold them in that same light.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's this interesting balance with all that. So, as I go back to my example, so people can really see how this plays out for somebody when you're doing the work, right? Is, for me it was recognizing, look, I'm not going to have the kind of relationship with those people in my circle, right? That I have with other people in my circle that where we have a lot of dialogue and they're interested in my life and I'm interested in theirs and we go back and forth and we have mutual conversation about, stuff. And instead, it's just going to be very superficial. It's going to be transactional. And because it's in my family circle, it's like I had to come to terms with like, that's okay. It's okay to have relationships like that, even in your family. It's okay.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
so true. Um, and I'm thinking about, what what practices or how can we encourage our listeners to start, you know, um, letting things come forward, right?
Yeah.
Your example of, wanting to be seen and heard from a very young age,
Mhm.
what strikes me is that when we want to be seen or heard, as we stay in that shadow, as we keep that part of us, kind of hidden,
Yeah.
um, even if we want it, no one is going to bring it to us. No one is
Yeah.
going to make that happen for us.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things I think about the beauty of the shadow work is one, it's a clue into what
Mhm.
your heart really desires,
Yep. Yep.
right?
Yep.
And how can you develop that for yourself to,
Yeah.
to better all of your whole beingness, right? To
Yeah.
create that
Yeah.
beautiful life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. I think we could think of lots and lots of shadow examples for our listeners, and I know we have on other shows. We've come and
Yes.
spoken into this. Is there anything, Laurel, that's coming up for you as an example that you feel like would be maybe a little different than mine, or whatever that we could use as another example to do a little bit of that strategic breaking it down? How do you actually learn from your shadow?
I mean, the example that comes to my mind is, I've had many experiences with other people where and it's similar to yours, where it's not that they are speaking too much or not listening, but they, they perhaps, it's the word selfish, right? That I would put them
Yeah.
in a category of selfish, where they are more self-serving than I am. And it makes me crazy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But what really, in working through that, again, back to the exercise of, when have I ever been that way. And the question I often ask myself is, there's some aspect of that that I want to be,
Yeah.
yet I haven't been able to access that part of me. And so why, right?
Yeah.
And you know, I can say that, you know, um we learn the same lesson. I believe this. The same situation will show up in our lifetime and time again. You know, a good friend of mine says, you know, same message, different earth suit, right?
Yeah.
Um, I've had people like this in my life time and time again. Could been a manager, a boss, you know, a relative, and working through it, realizing, oh, this is what I'm experiencing again. How can I let this part of me grow and come out a little bit so that I don't judge those people who have fully
Yeah.
developed their ability to put themselves first, right?
Yeah. Right.
And
Right.
because I do know, you know, whenever my shadow shows up, regardless of the situation, it's really, as I say, the clue of I need to work on this because I want to let this side of me show.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I do have a recent example.
Oh,
My
good.
husband is
Okay.
not a listener, but if he was, he would know this is about him because it is. Recently, not that long ago, we had a conversation and we disagreed on something, and it was a conversation that didn't go well, and I will gladly or honestly admit that, you know, I did some self-reflection afterwards and knew that I could have handled that conversation better. I could have communicated better with more respect
Mm,
and integrity.
yeah.
And so the next day, you know, I apologized and I said, you know, I didn't handle that conversation very well, and I'm sorry. It's important to me that we continue to talk about this. And he hugged me and said, "Oh, it's okay. I know when you act like that, you're not yourself." Well,
Mm,
I can tell you a shot of energy just came right up through my whole being. And
yeah.
I moved away and said, what if I was being myself? What
Mm,
if she is me and I
mm,
can be both,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and it was so interesting because it really was, um, you know, his forgiveness and the words that he said, but I really felt it more as dismissive of that side of me. And of course, he would be dismissive of that side of me if I was dismissive of that side of me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, how can I learn from that? You
Yeah.
know, it reminded me not to dismiss those parts of me, to,
Right.
as you're saying, to learn how to bring them forward where with more grace
Yeah.
and respect.
Right. Right. You know, I think I went to see the Barbie movie the other
Oh,
day.
you did?
I did. I highly recommend it to all women, particularly of our generation or anyone that played with Barbies, because they'll get it, you know, they'll get the whole thing. And then it's a very layered, um, philosophical, existential movie, right? With tons of really interesting and potent messages in it. And at one point in the movie, which is probably, I'm sure it's been recorded and is out there somewhere for people to access, one of the women in the movie gives a speech about how women are supposed to be. You know, we're supposed to be kind, we're supposed to be compassionate, we're supposed to be whatever, but we can't be, you know, this, right? And so it's this dilemma that we find ourselves in, right? And so what you were doing was just kind of speaking into that. It's like, well, I'm supposed to be kind and everything, but I'm not really supposed to speak my mind in a passionate way, right? It's like, so how do I be honest, right? I'm supposed to be honest, but I'm not supposed, you know, like it's like we're caught in this, like how we can't get it right because, and what it really speaks into, and this is really important for us to all think about, right, is all these long standing indirect and direct rules about how women and men are supposed to behave in the world. And it speaks into men's behavior as well. So it's like a very dynamic, you know, movie in terms of like the messaging in it. It's not just for women, but women will get it more because, you know, many of us played with Barbies, you know, and so anyway, it's this idea of how do, it takes a lot of work to release these messages from our imprints, from our conditioning and the way that we're behaving in the world, and yet show up right the way that we really want to. Like, I want to be able to be angry, but I don't want to show up as an angry, mean person. That's not how I want to display my anger, but I want to be allowed to feel my anger and to share it when I feel it, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is what we can learn from our shadow, right? Is
Yes.
how do we take the time and make the effort to do this well? Because that's when we make the biggest impact too with other people.
Yes. And
Yeah.
when you were talking about, how do we this imprint, right? The messages, right?
Yeah.
And it reminded me of when you said earlier, courage, right? It
Yeah.
right, it takes courage. We have to be willing not only to witness our shadow,
Yeah.
to develop a relationship with it, to want to nurture and grow that side of us. And we have to be courageous enough to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's so important.
Yeah. And I want to come back to the compassion piece, Laurel, because I feel like that's you spoke into it a little bit, but I want to reinforce it before we close the show because I do
Yeah.
feel like working with our shadow can teach us so much compassion, right? It's like this. I think of myself as every time I do shadow work, it's like I'm expanding my sense of self energetically, psychologically, right? In my nervous system, even too, right? Where I am allowing more and more that I can hold in myself and then with others as well, right? So, because when I'm doing shadow work, right, and my example is so perfect, it's like not only was I encouraging myself to look at how it showed up in me, but in that process, I was developing my tolerance for others and their ways in the world and to be less judgment of that, more compassionate. There's a reason that they are the way that they are in the world, right? I
Yes.
don't know the full story of all of that. I know some of it. I don't know all of it. And I need to hold compassion that they can't even see that that's how they're behaving in the world, or that they're so uncomfortable with themselves that they can't be beyond whatever their repetitive patterns are. You know what I mean? And so
Yes.
it's like, it helps us like open our heart to the things that have been really difficult rather than just sitting in judgment of them. Yeah.
Yes. And I want to go back to whatever we are judging in others, usually we judge in ourselves,
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
and so when we think, humility, compassion, loving self-kindness,
Yeah.
courage, and the other thing that comes up for me is curiosity, right?
Mhm.
How can we be curious about our shadow?
Yeah.
And so curious to the extent when our shadow reveals itself through someone else,
Hmm.
right? When we experience someone else as our mirror,
Yeah.
how can we be so curious about that judgment is off the table,
Yeah. Yeah. That's
right?
great. That's great.
When I think about this, that exercise that I did years ago, what it really did for me, as much as showing me a side of my shadow that I was hiding, or a side of myself I was hiding, it really gave me a deep human connection with some other people that I judged, right? That I
Yeah.
did not admire, right? That I did not come into as being me, right? And I know, like, the philosophy that I am you and you are me, that we are one, we are the same. um Bringing that, that especially when my shadow shows up, I don't feel a connection with that side of myself. And if someone brings that shadow to me, I can tell you I don't feel connected to them.
Yeah.
But bringing it back to, i am I am you and you are me, I am that person and that person is me, we're no different from one another.
Right.
It really does bring this humanity, like, oh, are they that different from me? No, they're not.
Yeah. And we need that so badly in the
Oh,
world today because
yes.
we're so quick to be them and us, them and us. And it's like, we're doing ourselves such a disservice. Ultimately, we're making our lives really miserable by doing that. I work really hard at cleaning up my language around that, like really when I'm in that space, I'm like, why am I saying that? And I need to back up a couple steps. And how can I think about that differently and put it out in the world a little bit differently? Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
and
really important.
I think we need to accept our whole self in
Yeah.
order to accept the whole humanity of on the planet, right?
Yeah.
Like we compartmentalize our
Yeah.
own self, what we don't like, what we admire, what we don't admire, what we trust and what we don't trust, right? We compartmentalize all of our own self.
Yeah.
And we, because we're so good at that without even being cognitively aware that that's what we do,
Yeah.
we take that ability out into the world with us and we compartmentalize the world around us, I believe.
I totally agree with you. And you can see, I mean, if you're willing to look in the mirror, you can see how that is happening, right?
Yeah.
And to soften to that and to like do. So, what can we learn from the shadow work, right? We can all learn how to live better together. Ultimately, I
Yes.
mean,
Yes.
the biggest benefit, to doing your shadow work is that we can all live better together as a more cohesive group of people of humanity helping and supporting one another ultimately. Yeah. It's
And
huge.
I think about, imagine every day moving through the world when you accept your whole self for who you are.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
to me, we talk about courage,
Mm.
but that knowing that I don't have that ability yet, but the more I keep practicing, appreciating, loving, respecting my whole being,
Yeah.
it really is a powerful thought for me. I can't wait for the day I can show up and love every part of myself.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I feel like I'm there. I'd like to say I do feel like mostly I'm there. It's a rare day when I don't really feel that way anymore, which is great, So I'll just gonna plug my book because you were talking about courage so
Yes.
much, my book, Courageous Woman, teaches the 8 practices of the inner power wheel. If you want to work with your inner life and you want to find a pathway to like find that inner peace and feel really good in the world, like those practices will bring you there if you're willing to really work them, work them, work them. Yeah. So, um,
So good.
Laurel, thank you for sharing your example and also, the example of the work that you did, because I feel like that's a great journaling exercise. So if you missed that earlier in the show, go back, rewind. Laurel gives that example of, how you can start to do some shadow work there. And the one that's coming up for me really strongly is I want to make sure I say this before we close out. Think about where you are in your life right now. Think about what you most want. What if you could change anything right now and make it happen in your life and you think you'd be really happy or you'd feel really good about your life? What would that be? And now I want you to suspend how you've been thinking about it all for a little while. Just set it aside a little bit. And I want you to invite yourself onto the adventure of that there is an inner solution to getting there. And perhaps it has to do with your shadow. And so as you begin to imagine that this would be your pathway there, right? Where can you begin? Like what is it that I'm not seeing in myself or I'm not willing to look at in myself, or I'm afraid of in myself, right? Or I'm afraid of doing or becoming or whatever, that if I could change that or work with it really well, that it might actually take me there or to some version of that, right?
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's been my truth.
Yeah,
So, yeah, that's why we're here on the podcast sharing all this, right, Laurel? Is because we know that that pathway can take you there.
it can.
It just takes a lot of courage to do the work.
It does.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for a great conversation today. Yeah.
Another great
Another
conversation.
great conversation. Okay. Well, we'll be back for more conversations with our listeners, and we want to invite you to Let us know your thoughts on this. We really would love to have more dialogue, and both in our Facebook group and even here in the comment streams of, wherever you're
Yes.
listening. Yeah, for sure. We're here
And
and we'll talk back. We are here. We'll
and
answer.
that's right.
Yeah.
And if our listeners need through some shadow work,
Yeah.
right? Learning
Yeah.
courage,
Yeah.
self-compassion.
Yeah.
And even, when I think about learning how to live as a whole being,
Yeah.
we do that work every day with our clients. And so I
Every
want to
day.
invite them.
Yeah.
If they need help, we're here.
We're here. We're here. We'd love to help you in our coaching worlds too. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right,
Well,
Laurel,
thank
off
you.
we go. Till next time. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye for
Bye,
now.
listeners.